Hey everybody, my name is Andrew. This is the Optimal Time, and I know what you're thinking. The hell's going on? Well, today we're going to be doing something different. Instead of playing a game like we usually do, I'm going to read you a book, or at least part of one anyway. I have this book here. It was recommended by a dear friend of mine, and it's really good, and I wanted to read it. And I find that I have a little bit of problems staying with reading a book. I can't seem to finish them as well as I used to. So figured why not share this opportunity to read it to you guys out there. So in case you want a hackneyed audiobook or whatever have you, we have this. Shout outs to RainRider Ambiance for the library ambiance. I figured that was fitting. And yeah, so we're going to read this book, Cinder by Marissa Meyer of the Lunar Chronicles. Should be a fun time. Be sure to get yourself a snack or a drink and get comfy. Seriously, get comfortable. This is different. This is very different. We're going to do this. I got myself a little Capri Sun action here. Ah. Fruit punch. Not as good as strawberry kiwi, but it's up there. Now, be sure to kick your feet up, because again, it's comfortable. We want to enjoy ourselves to the fullest extent on this stream. And I'm going to read this out loud, hence why the microphone's right here. So, yeah, feel free to zone out and let me take you off to Storyland. Cinder by Marissa Meyer. Book 1. While her sisters were given beautiful dresses and fine slippers, Cinderella had only a filthy smock and wooden shoes. Chapter 1. The screw through Cinder's ankle had rusted, the engraved cross marks worn to a mangled circle. Her knuckles ached from forcing the screwdriver into the joint as she struggled to loosen the screw, one gritting twist after another. By the time it was extracted far enough for her to wrench free with her prosthetic steel hand, the hairline threads had been stripped clean. Tossing the screwdriver onto the table, Cinder gripped her heel and yanked the foot from its socket. A spark singed her fingertips and she jerked away, leaving the foot to dangle from a tangle of red and yellow wires. She slumped back with a relieved groan. A sense of release hovered at the end of those wires. Freedom. Having loathed the too small foot for 4 years, she swore to never put the piece of junk back on again. She had hoped Aiko would be back soon with its replacement. Cinder was the only full-service mechanic at New Beijing's weekly market. Without a sign, her booth hinted at her trade only by the shelves of stock Android parts that crowded the walls. It was squeezed into a shady cove between a used NetScreen dealer and a silk merchant, both of whom frequently complained about the dingy smell of metal and grease that came from Cinder's booth, even though it was usually disguised by the aroma of honey buns from the bakery across the square. Cinder knew they really just didn't like being next to her. A stained tablecloth divided Cinder from browsers as they shuffled past. The square was filled with shoppers and hawkers, children and noise. The bellows of men as they bargained with robotic shopkeepers trying to talk the computers down from their desired profit margins. The hum of ID scanners and monotone voice receipts as money changed accounts. The net screens that covered every building and filled the air with the chatter of advertisements, news reports, gossip. Cinder's auditory interface dulled the noise into a static thrumming, but today one melody lingered above the rest that she just couldn't drown out. A ring of children were standing just outside her booth, trilling, "Ashes, ashes, we all fall down," and then laughing hysterically as they collapsed to the pavement. A smile tugged at Cinder's lips. Not so much at the nursery rhyme, a phantom song about pestilence and death that had regained popularity in the past decade. The song itself made her squeamish, but she did love the glares from passerby as the giggling children fell over in their paths. The inconveniences of having to swarm around the writhing bodies stirred grumbles from the shoppers, and Cinder adored the children for it. "Sunto! Sunto!" Cinder's amusement wilted. She spotted Chung Sacha, the baker, pushing through the crowd in her flower-coated apron. "Sunto, come here! I told you not to play so close to—" Sacha met Cinder's gaze. nodded her lips, then grabbed her son by the arm and spun away. The boy whined, dragging his feet as Sacha ordered him to stay closer to their booth. Cinder wrinkled her nose at the bakers retreating back. The remaining children fled into the crowd, taking their bright laughter with them. "It's not like wires are contagious," Cinder muttered to her empty booth. With a spine-popping stretch, she pulled her dirty fingers through her hair, combing it up into a messy tail, then grabbed her blackened work gloves. She covered her steel hand first, and, though her right palm began to sweat immediately inside the thick material, she felt more comfortable with the gloves on. Hiding the plating with her left hand, she stretched her fingers wide, working out the cramp that had formed at the fleshy base of her thumb from clenching the screwdriver, and squinted again into the city square. She spotted plenty of stocky white androids in the din, but none of them Ico. Sighing, Cinder bent over the toolbox beneath the workbench. After digging through the jumbled mess of screwdrivers and wrenches, she emerged with the fuse puller that had been long buried at the bottom. One by one, she disconnected the wires that linked her foot and ankle, each spurting a tiny spark. She couldn't feel them through the gloves, but her retina display helpfully informed her with the blinking red text that she was losing connection to the limb. With a yank of the last wire, her foot clattered onto the concrete. The difference was instant. For once in her life, she felt weightless. She made room for the discarded foot on the table, setting it up like a shrine amid the wrenches and lug nuts, before hunkering over her ankle again and cleaning the grime from the socket with an old rag. Thud. Cinder jerked, her head smacking the underside of the table. She shoved back from the desk, her scowl landing first on a lifeless android that sat squat on her work table, and then on the man behind it. She was met with startled copper-brown eyes and black hair that hung past his ears, and lips that every girl in the country had admired 1,000 times. Her scowl vanished. His own surprise was short-lived, melting into an apology. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't realize anyone was back there." Cinder barely heard him above the blankness in her mind. With her heartbeat gathering speed, her retina display scanned his features. So familiar from years spent watching him on the net screens, he seemed taller in real life, and gray hooded sweatshirt was like none of the fine clothes he usually made appearances in. But still, it only took 2.6 seconds for Cinder's scanner to measure the points of his face and link his image to the net database. Another second, and the display informed her of what she already knew. Details scribbled across the bottom of her vision in a stream of green text. Prince Cato, Crown Prince of the Eastern Commonwealth, ID number 0082719057, born 7 April 108 TE, FF 88987, media hits, reverse cron, post 14 August 126 TE. A press meeting is to be hosted by Prince Kai on 15 August to discuss the ongoing letumosis research and possible leads for an antidote. Cinder launched up from her chair, nearly toppling over when she forgot about her missing limb. Steadying herself with both hands on the table, she managed an awkward bow. The retina display sank out of sight. "Your Highness," she stammered, head lowered, glad that he could see her empty ankle from behind the tablecloth. The prince flinched and cast a glance over his shoulder before hunching over. Maybe, he put his fingers across his lips, "on the Highness stuff." Wide-eyed, Cinder forced a shaky nod. "Right, of course. How can are you—" She swallowed, the words sticking like bean paste to her tongue. "I'm looking for a Lynn Cinder," said the prince. "Is he around?" Cinder dared to lift one stabilizing hand from the table, using it to tug the hem of her glove higher on her wrist. Staring at the prince's chest, she stammered, I'm Lynn Cinder." Her eyes followed his hand as he planted it on top of the android's bulbous head. "You're Lynn Cinder?" "Yes, your high—" She bit down on her lip. "The mechanic?" She nodded. "How can I help you?" Instead of answering, the prince bent down, craning his neck so that she had no choice but to meet his eyes, and dashed a grin at her. Her heart winced. The prince straightened, forcing her gaze to follow him. "You're not quite what I was expecting." Well, you're hardly what I... Um... Unable to hold his gaze, Cinder reached for the android and pulled it to her side of the table. What seems to be wrong with the android, Your Highness? The android looked like it had just stepped off the conveyor belt, but Cinder could tell from the mock feminine shape that it was an outdated model. The design was sleek, though, with a spherical head atop a pear-shaped body and a glossy white finish. I can't get her to turn on, said Prince Kai, watching as Cinder examined the robot. She was working fine one day, and the next, nothing. Cinder turned the android around so its sensor light faced the prince. She was glad to have routine tasks for her hands and routine questions for her mouth. Something to focus on so she wouldn't get flustered and lose control of her brain's net connection again. Have you had any problems with her before? No, she gets a monthly checkup from the Royal Mechanics, and this is the first real problem she's ever had. Leaning forward, Prince Kai picked up Cinder's small metal foot from the work table, turning it curiously over in his palms. Cinder tensed, watching as he peered into the wired-filled cavity. Filled with the flexible joints of the toes, he used the too long sleeve of his sweatshirt to polish off a smudge. Aren't you hot? Cinder said, instantly regretting the question when his attention returned to her. For the briefest moment, the prince almost looked embarrassed. Dying, he said, but I'm trying to be inconspicuous. Cinder considered telling him that it wasn't working, but thought better of it. The lack of a throng of screaming girls around her booth was probably evidence that it was working better than she suspected. Instead of looking like a royal heartthrob, he just looked crazy. Clearing her throat, Cinder refocused on the android. She found the nearly invisible latch and opened its back panel. Why aren't the Royal Mechanics fixing her? They tried to, but couldn't figure it out. Someone suggested I bring her to you. He set the foot down and turned his attention to the shelves of old and battered parts. Parts for androids, hovers, net screens, port screens, parts for cyborgs. They say you're the best mechanic in New Beijing. I was expecting an old man. Do they? She murmured. He wasn't the first to voice surprise. Most of her customers couldn't fathom how a teenage girl could be the best mechanic in the city, and she never broadcast the reason for her talent. The fewer people who knew she was a cyborg, the better. She was sure she'd go mad if all the market shopkeepers looked at her with the same disdain as Cheng Sasha did. She nudged some of the android's wires aside with her pinky. Sometimes they just get worn out. Maybe it's time to upgrade to a new model. I'm afraid I can't do that. She contains top-secret information. It's a matter of national security that I retrieve it before anyone else does. Fingers stalling, Cinder glanced up at him. He held her gaze for a full 3 seconds before his lips twitched. I'm just joking. Nancy was my first android. It's sentimental. An orange light flickered in the corner of Cinder's vision. Her optobionics had picked up on something, though she didn't know what. An extra swallow, a too quick blink, a clenching of the prince's jaw. She was used to the little orange light. It came up all the time. It meant someone was lying. National security, she said. Funny. The prince lifted his head, as if challenging her to contradict him. A strand of black hair fell into his eyes. Cinder looked away. Tudor 8.6 model, she said, reading the faintly lit panel inside the plastic cranium. The android was nearly 20 years old. Ancient for an android. She looks to be in pristine condition. Raising her fist, she thunked the android hard on the side of the head, barely catching it before it toppled over onto the table. The prince jumped. Cinder set the android back on its treads and jabbed the power button, but nothing happened. Would be surprised how often that works. The prince let out a single awkward chuckle. Are you sure you're Lynn Cinder, the mechanic? Cinder, I've got it! Aiko wheeled out of the crowd and jumped up to the work table, her blue sensor flashing. Lifting one pronged hand, she slammed a brand new steel-plated foot onto the desk, in the shadow of the prince's android. It's a huge improvement over the old one, only lightly used, and the wiring looks compatible as is. Plus, I was able to get the dealer down to just 600 units. Panic jolted through Cinder. Still balancing on her human leg, she snatched the foot off the table and dropped it behind her. Good work, Aiko. Niu and Shifu will be delighted to have a replacement foot for his escort droid. Aiko's sensor dimmed. Niu and Shifu? I don't compute. Smiling through locked teeth, Cinder gestured at the prince. Aiko, please pay your respects to our customer, she lowered her voice. His Imperial Highness? Aiko craned her head, aiming the round sensor up at the prince, who towered more than 3 feet above her. The light flared as her scanner recognized him. Prince Kai, she said, her metallic voice squeaking, you're even more handsome in person! Cinder's stomach twisted in embarrassment, even as the prince laughed. That's enough, Aiko. Get in the booth. Aiko obeyed, pushing aside the tablecloth and ducking under the table. You don't see a personality like that every day, said Prince Kai, leaning against the booth's door frame as if he brought androids to the market all the time. Did you program her yourself? Believe it or not, she came that way. I suspect a programming error, which is probably why my stepmother got her so cheap. I do not have a programming error, said Aiko from behind her. Cinder met the prince's gaze, was caught momentarily dazzled by another easy laugh, and ducked her head behind the droid, his android. So what do you think? He asked. I'll need to run her diagnostics. It will take me a few days, maybe a week. Tucking a strand of hair behind one ear, Cinder sat down, grateful to give her leg a rest while she examined the android's innards. She knew she must be breaking some rule of etiquette, but the prince didn't seem to mind as he tipped forward, watching her hands. Do you need payment up front? He held his left wrist toward her, embedded with his ID chip, but Cinder waved a gloved hand at him. No, thank you. It would be my honor. Prince Kai looked about to protest, but then let his hand fall. I don't suppose there's any hope of having her done before the festival. Cinder shut the android's panel. I don't think that will be a problem, but without knowing what's wrong with her... I know, he rocked back on his heels. Just wishful thinking. How will I contact you when she's ready? Send a comm to the palace, or will you be here again next weekend? I could stop by then. Oh yes, said Aiko from the back of the booth. We're here We're here every market day. You should come by again. That would be lovely. Cinder flinched. You don't need to. It'll be my pleasure. He dipped his head in polite farewell, simultaneously pulling the edges of the hood farther over his face. Cinder returned the nod, knowing she should have stood and bowed, but not daring to test her balance a second time. She waited until his shadow had disappeared from the tabletop before surveying the square. The prince's presence among the harried crowd seemed to have gone unnoticed. Cinder let her muscles relax. Aiko rolled to her side, clasping her metal grippers over her chest. Prince Kai, check my fan. I think I'm overheating. Cinder bent over and picked up her replacement foot, dusting it off on her cargo pants. She checked the plating, glad that she hadn't dented it. Can you imagine Peony's expression when she hears about this? Said Aiko. I can imagine a lot of high-pitched squealing. Cinder allowed one more wary scan of the crowd before the first tickle of giddiness stirred inside her. She couldn't wait to tell Peony. The prince himself. An abrupt laugh escaped her. It was uncanny. It was... Oh dear! Cinder's smile fell. What? Aiko pointed at her forehead with her pronged finger. You have a grease splotch! Cinder jerked back and scrubbed at her brow. You're kidding. I'm sure he hardly noticed. Cinder dropped her hand. What does it matter? Go on, help me put this on before any other royalty stops by. She propped her ankle on the opposite knee and began connecting the color-coordinated wires, wondering if the prince had been fooled. Fits like a glove, doesn't it? Aiko said, holding a handful of screws while Cinder twisted them into the pre-drilled holes. It's very nice, Aiko. Thank you. I just hope Adri doesn't notice. She'll murder me if she knew I'd spent 600 univs on a foot. She tightened the last screw and stretched out her leg, rolling her ankle back, forward, wiggling the toes. It was a little stiff, and the nerve sensors would need a few days to harmonize with the updated wiring, but at least she wouldn't have to hop or limp around off-kilter anymore. It's perfect, she said, putting on her boot. She spotted her old foot held in Aiko's pincers. You can throw that piece of junk away. A scream filled Cinder's ears. She flinched, the sound peaking in her audio interface, and turned around toward it. The market silenced. The children who had switched to a game of hide-and-seek among the clustered booths crept out from their hiding spots. The scream had come from the baker, Chang Sacha, baffled. Baffled, Cinder stood and climbed on top of her chair to peer over the crowd. She spotted Sacha in her booth, behind the glass case of sweetbread and pork buns, gawking at her outstretched hands. Cinder clamped a hand over her nose at the same moment realization skittered through the rest of the square. "The plague!" someone yelled. "She has the plague!" The street filled with panic. Mothers scooped up their children, making their faces with desperate hands as they scrambled to get away from Sacha's booth. Shopkeepers slammed shut their rolling doors. Sunto screamed and rushed towards his mother, but she held her hands out to him. No, stay back. A neighboring shopkeeper grabbed the boy, tucking the child under his arm as he ran. Sacha yelled something after him, but the words were lost in the uproar. Cinder's stomach churned. They couldn't run or Aiko would be trampled in the chaos. Holding her breath, she reached for the cord at the boot's corner and yanked the metal door down its rail. Darkness cloaked them but for a single shred of daylight above the ground. The heat rose up from the concrete floor, stifling in the cramped space. "Cinder?" said Aiko, worrying in her robotic voice. She brightened her sensor, washing the booth in blue light. "Don't worry," Cinder said, hopping down from the chair and grabbing the grease-covered rag from the table. The screams were already fading, transforming the booth into its own empty universe. "She's all the way across the square. We're fine here." But she slipped back toward the wall of shelves anyway, crouched down and covered her nose and mouth with the rag. There they waited, Cinder breathing as shallowly as possible until they heard the sirens of the emergency hover come and take Sacha away. Chapter 2. The emergency sirens hadn't faded before the hum of another engine rumbled into the square. The market's silence was split by feet thumping on the pavement and then someone spitting commands. Someone else's guttural response. Slinging her messenger bag across her back, Cinder crept across the dusty floor of her booth and pushed past the tablecloth that draped her work desk. She slipped her fingers into the gap of light beneath the door and inched it open. Pressing her cheek to the warm, gritty pavement, she was able to make out 3 sets of yellow boots across the square. An emergency crew. She peeled the door open farther and watched the men, all wearing gas masks, as they doused the interior of the booth with liquid from a yellow can. Even across the square, Cinder wrinkled her nose at the stench. "What's happening?" Aiko asked from behind her. "They're going to burn Changji's booth." Cinder's eyes swept along the square, noting the pristine white hover paint planted in the corner. Other than the 3 men, the square was abandoned. Rolling onto her back, Cinder peered up into Aiko's sensor, which still glowing faintly in the dark. "We'll leave when the flames start, when they're distracted." "Are we in trouble?" "No, I just can't be bothered with the trip to the quarantines today." One of the men spouted an order, followed by shuffling feet. Cinder turned her head and squinted through the gap. A flame was thrown into the booth. The smell of gasoline was soon met with that of burned toast. The men stood back, their uniforms silhouetted against the glowing flames. Reaching up, Cinder grabbed Prince Kai's android around its neck and pulled it down beside her, tucking it under one arm. She slid the door open enough to crawl through. Keeping her eyes on the men's backs, Aiko followed, scooting against the next booth as Cinder lowered the door. They darted along the storefronts, most left wide open during the mass exodus, and turned into the first skinny alley between shops. Black smoke blotted the sky above them. Seconds later, a horde of news hovers buzzed over the buildings on their way to the market square. Cinder slowed when they'd put enough distance between them and the market, emerging from a maze of alleys. The sun had passed overhead and was descending behind the skyscrapers to the west. The air sweated with August heat, but an occasional warm breeze was funneled between the buildings, picking up whirlwinds of garbage from the gutters. 4 blocks from the market, signs of life appeared again on the streets. Pedestrians pooling on the sidewalks and gossiping about the plague outbreak in the city center. Net screens implanted into building walls showed live feeds of fire and smoke in downtown New Beijing, and panic headlines in which the toll of infected mounted by the second, even though only 1 person had been confirmed sick so far as Cinder could tell. All those sticky buns, Aiko said as they passed a close-up shot of the blackened booth. Cinder bit the inside corner of her cheek. Neither of them had ever sampled the acclaimed sweets of the market bakery. Aiko didn't have taste buds, and Changsacha didn't serve cyborgs. Towering offices and shopping centers gradually melded with the messy assortment of apartment buildings, built so close that they became an unending stretch of glass and concrete. Apartments in this corner of the city had once been spacious and desirable, but have been so subdivided and remodeled over time, always trying to cram more people into the same square footage, that the buildings had become labyrinths of corridors and stairwells. But all the crowded ugliness was briefly forgotten as Cinder turned the corner onto her own street. For half a step, New Beijing Palace could be glimpsed between complexes, sprawling and serene on the cliff that overlooked the city. The palace's pointed gold roof sparkled with orange beneath the sun. The windows glinted the light back at the city. The ornate gables, the tiered pavilions that teetered dangerously close to the cliff's edge, the rounded temples stretching to the heavens. Cinder paused longer than usual to look up at it, thinking about someone who lived beyond those walls, who was up there perhaps this very second. Not that she hadn't known the prince lived there every time she'd seen the palace before, but today she felt a connection that she'd never had before, and with it came an almost smug delight. She had met the prince. He had come to her booth. He knew her name. Sucking in a breath of humid air, Cinder forced herself to turn away, feeling childish. She was starting to sound like Peony. She was going to start sounding like Peony. Yep. She shifted the royal android to her other arm as she and Aiko ducked beneath the overhang of the Phoenix Tower apartments. She flashed her freed wrist to the ID scanner on the wall and heard the clunking of the lock. Aiko used her arm extensions to clomp down the stairs as they descended into the basement, a dim maze of storage spaces caged with chicken wire. As a wave of musty air blew up to meet them, the android turned on her floodlight, dispersing the shadows from the sparse halogens. It was the familiar path from the stairwell to storage space number 18-20, the cramped, always chilly cell that Adri allowed Cinder to use for her work. Cinder cleared a space for the android among the work table's clutter and sent her messenger bag on the floor. She swapped her heavy work gloves for less grungy cotton ones before locking up the storage room. "If Adri asks," she said as they made their way to the elevators, "our booth is nowhere near the baker's." Aiko's light flickered. "Noted!" Yeah. They were alone in the elevator. It wasn't until they stepped out onto the 18th floor that the building became a crawling hive. Children chasing each other down the corridors, both domestic and stray cats creeping tight against the walls, the ever-constant blur of net screen chatter spilling from the doorways. Cinder adjusted the white noise output from her brain interface as she dodged the children on her way to the apartment. The door was wide open, making Cinder pause and check the number before entering. She heard Audrey's stiff voice from the living room. "Lower neckline for Peony. She looks like an old woman." No, maybe not. Lower neckline. Lower neckline for Peony. She looks like an old woman. Cinder peered around the corner. Audrey was standing with one hand on the mantel of the holographic fireplace, wearing a chrysanthemum embroidered bathrobe that blended in with the collection of garish paper fans that covered the wall behind her, reproductions made to look antique. With her face shimmering with too much powder and her lips painted horrifically bright, Adri almost looked like a reproduction herself. Her face was made up as if she had been planning to go somewhere, although she rarely left the apartment. If she noticed Cinder loitering in the doorway, she ignored her. The net screen above the heatless flames was showing footage from the market. Baker's booth had been reduced to rubble and the skeleton of a portable oven. In the center of the room, Pearl and Peony each stood swathed in silk and tulle. Tulle? Toya. Yeah. Peony was holding up her dark curly hair while a woman Cinder didn't recognize fidgeted with her dress's neckline. Peony caught sight of Cinder over the woman's shoulder and her eyes sparked, a glow bursting across her face. She gestured at the dress with a barely silent squeal. Cinder grinned back. Her younger stepsister looked angelic, her dress all silver and shimmering with hints of lavender when caught in the fire's light. Pearl, Audrey gestured to her older daughter with a twirling finger, and Pearl spun around, displaying a row of pearl buttons down her back. Her dress matched Peony's with a snug bodice and flouncy skirt, only it was made of stardust gold. Let's take in her waist some more. Threading a pin through the hem of Peony's neckline, the stranger started at seeing Cinder in the doorway, but quickly turned away. Stepping back, the woman removed a bundle of sharp pins from between her lips and tilted her head down to one side. It's already very snug. We want her to dance, don't we? We want her to find a husband, said Audrey. No, no, the seamstress tittered, even as she reached out and pinched the material around Pearl's waist. Cinder could tell Pearl was sucking in her stomach as much as she could. She detected the edges of ribs beneath the fabric. She is much too young for marriage. I'm 17, Pearl said, glaring at the woman. 17, see? Oh, 17, see? A child. Now's for fun, right, girl? She was too expensive for fun, said Audrey. I expect results from this gown. Do not worry, Lingji. She will be lovely as morning dew. Stuffing the pins back into her mouth, the woman returned her focus to Peony's neckline. Audrey lifted her chin and finally acknowledged Cinder's presence by swiping her gaze down Cinder's filthy boots and cargo pants. Why aren't you at the market? It closed down early today, said Cinder, with a meaningful look at the net screen that Audrey didn't follow, feigning nonchalance. Nonchalance. Yeah, I said that right. Nonchalance. Cinder thrust a thumb toward the hall. So I'll just go get cleaned up, and then I'll be ready for my dress fitting. The seamstress paused. Another dress, Lingji? I did not bring material for... Have you replaced the mag belt on the hover yet? Cinder's smile faltered. No, not yet. Well, none of us will be going to the ball unless that gets fixed, will we? Cinder stifled her irritation. They'd already had this conversation twice this past week. I need money to buy a new mag belt, 800 univs at least. If income from the market wasn't deposited directly into your account, I would have bought one by now. And trust you not to spend it on all your frivolous toys. Audrey said toys with a glare, Aiko, and a curl of her lip, even though Aiko technically belonged to her. Besides, I can't afford both a mag belt and a new dress that you'll only wear once. You'll have to find some other way of fixing the hover or find your own gal for the ball. Irritation hardened in Cinder's gut. She might have pointed out that Pearl and Peony could have been given ready-made rather than custom dresses in order to budget for Cinder's as well. She might have pointed out that they would only wear their dresses one time too. She might have pointed out that, as she was the one doing the work, the money should have been hers to spend as she saw fit. But all arguments would come to nothing. Legally, Cinder belonged to Audrey as much as the household android, and so too did her money. Her few possessions, even the new foot she'd just attached. Audrey loved to remind her of that. So she stomped the anger down before Audrey could see a spark of rebellion. I may be able to offer a trade for the mag belt. I'll check with the local shops. Audrey sniffed. Why don't we trade that worthless android for it? Aiko ducked behind Cinder's legs. We wouldn't get much for her. Nobody wants such an old model. No, they don't they? Perhaps I'll have to sell both of you off as spare parts. Audrey reached forward and fidgeted with the unfinished hem of Pearl's sleeve. I don't care how you fix the hover, just fix it before the ball. And cheaply. I don't need that pile of junk taking up valuable parking space. Cinder tucked her hands back into her back pockets. Are you saying that if I fix the hover and get a dress, I can really go this year? Audrey's lips puckered slightly at the corners. It will be a miracle if you can find something suitable to wear with that will hide your... Her gaze dropped to Cinder's boots. Eccentricities. But yes, if you fix the hover, I suppose you can go to the ball. Peony flashed Cinder a stunned half-smile, while her older sister spun on their mother. You can't be serious! Her? Go with us? Cinder pressed her shoulder into the doorframe, trying to hide her disappointment from Peony. This is Cinderella. This is Cinderella. I'm taking a second. I'm taking a second to acknowledge this. This is Cinderella. I should have gotten it because in the book 1 section, this is Cinderella. Anyway. Cinder pressed her shoulder into the doorframe, trying to hide her disappointment from Peony. Pearl's outrage was unnecessary. A little orange light had flickered in the corner of Cinder's vision. Adri had not meant her promise. Well, she said, attempting to look heartened, I guess I'd better go find a mag belt then. Adri flourished her arm at Cinder, her attention once again captivated by Pearl's dress. A silent dismissal. Cinder cast one more look at her stepsister's sumptuous gowns before backing out of the room. She had barely turned toward the hallway when Peony squealed. Prince Kai! Freezing, Cinder glanced back at the next screen. The plague alerts had been replaced with a live broadcast from the palace's press room. Prince Kai was speaking to a crowd of journalists, human and android. Volume on, said Pearl, batting the seamstress away. Research continues to be our top priority, Prince Kai was saying, gripping the sides of the podium. Our research team is determined to find a vaccine for this disease that has now taken one of my parents and threatens to take the other, as well as tens of thousands of our citizens. The circumstances are made even more desperate in the face of the outbreak that occurred today within the city limits. No longer can we claim this disease is regulated to the poor rural communities of our country. Letimosis threatens us all, and we will find a way to stop it. Only then can we begin to rebuild our economy and return the Eastern Commonwealth to its once prosperous state. Unenthusiastic applause shifted through the crowd. Research on the plague had been underway since the first outbreak had occurred in a small town in the African Union over a dozen years ago. It seemed that very little progress had been made. Meanwhile, the disease had surfaced in hundreds of seemingly unconnected communities throughout the world. Hundreds of thousands of people had fallen ill, suffered, died. Even Audrey's husband had contracted it on a trip to Europe, the same trip during which he'd agreed to become the guardian of an 11-year-old orphaned cyborg. One of Cinder's few memories of the man was him being carted away to the quarantines, while Audrey raved at how he could not leave her with this thing. Audrey never talked about her husband, and few memories of him lingered in the apartment. The only reminder that he'd even existed was found in a row of holographic plates and carved medallions that lined the fireplace's mantel. Achievement awards and congratulatory prizes from an international technology fair, 3 years running. Cinder had no idea what he'd invented. Evidently, whatever it was hadn't taken off because he'd left his family almost no money when he had died. I'm gonna a little tea. Just a little tea. Little tea. It's a lot of talking. On the screen, the prince's speech was interrupted when a stranger stepped onto the platform and handed a note to Prince Kai. The prince's eyes clouded over. The screen blackened. The press room was replaced with a desk before a blue screen. A woman sat behind it, expressionless but with whitened knuckles atop the desk. We interrupt His Imperial Highness's press conference with an update on the status of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Riken. The Emperor's physicians have just informed us that His Majesty has entered into the 3rd stage of letimosis. Gasping, the seamstress pulled the pins from her mouth. Cinder pressed herself against the doorframe. She had not even thought to give Kai her condolences or wishes for the Emperor's return of health. He must think her so insensitive, so ignorant. We are told that everything is being done to ensure His Imperial Majesty's comfort at this time, and palace officials tell us that researchers are working non-stop in their search for a vaccine. Volunteers are still urgently needed for antidote testing, even as the cyborg draft continues. The weird typo. It doesn't end the quote anyway. There's been much controversy regarding the 126th annual Peace Festival to the Emperor's illness, but Prince Kaito has told the press that the festival will continue as scheduled, and that he hopes it might bring some joy in this otherwise tragic time. The anchor paused, hesitating, even with the prompter before her. Her face softened, and her stiff voice had a warble when she finished. Long live the Emperor. No, that wouldn't be me. Long live the Emperor. Something like that. The seamstress murmured the words back to the anchor. The screen went black again before returning to the press conference, but Prince Kai had left the stage, and the audience of journalists was in upheaval as they reported to their individual cameras. I know a cyborg who could volunteer for plague testing, said Pearl. Why wait for the draft? Cinder leveled a glare at Pearl, who was nearly 6 inches shorter than she was despite being a year older. Good idea, she said, and then you could get a job to pay for your pretty dress. Pearl snarled. They reimbursed the volunteers' families, wirehead. The cyborg draft had been started by some royal research team a year ago. Every morning, a new ID number was drawn from the pool of so many thousand cyborgs who resided in the Eastern Commonwealth. Subjects had been carted in from provinces as far-reaching as Mumbai and Singapore to act as guinea pigs for the antidote testing. It was made out to be some sort of honor, giving your life for the good of humanity, but it was really just a reminder that cyborgs were not like everyone else. Many of them had been given a second chance at life by the generous hand of scientists, and therefore owed their very existence to those who had created them. They were lucky to have lived this long, many thought. It's only right that they should be first to give up their lives in search for a cure. We can't volunteer Cinder, said Peony, bunching her skirt in her hands. I need her to fix my port screen. Pearl sniffed and turned away from both of them. Peony scrunched her nose at her sister's back. Stop bickering, said Adri. Peony, you're wrinkling your skirt. Cinder stepped back into the hallway as the seamstress returned to her work. Aiko was already 2 steps ahead of her, eager to escape Adri's presence. She appreciated Peony coming to her defense, and of course... but she knew in the end it wouldn't matter. Adri would never volunteer her for the testing, because that would be the end of her only income, and Cinder was sure her stepmother had never worked a day in her life. But if the draft chose her, no one could do anything about it, and it seemed that lately a disproportionate number of those chosen were from New Beijing and the surrounding suburbs. Every time one of the draft's victims was a teenage girl, Cinder imagined a clock ticking inside her head. That's gotta suck, knowing like every day might be your last, because you could get taken by this draft for everyone else. Chapter 3. You're going to the ball! Aiko tapped her grippers together in an imitation of clapping. We have to find you a dress and shoes. I will not allow you to wear those awful boots. We'll get you some new gloves and... Can you bring that light over here? Cinder said, yanking out the top drawer of her standing toolbox. She rifled through it, spare bolts and sockets jangling as Aiko scooted closer. A wash of bluish light dispersed the dimness of the storage room. Think of the food they'll have, said Aiko, and the dresses, and music! Cinder ignored her, selecting an assortment of varying tools and arranging them on Aiko's magnetic torso. Oh my stars, think about Prince Kai! You could dance with Prince Kai! This made Cinder pause and squint into Aiko's blinding light. Why would the prince dance with me? Aiko's fan hummed as she sought an answer. Because he won't have grease on your face this time! Cinder fought down a chuckle. Android reasoning could be so simplistic. I hate to break this to you, Aiko, she said, slamming in the drawer and moving on to the next, but I'm not going to the ball. Aiko's fan stopped momentarily. Started up again. Aiko's fan stopped momentarily. Started up again. I don't compute. For starters, I just spent my life savings on a new foot. But even if I did have money, why would I spend it on a dress or shoes or gloves? What a waste. What else could you have spent it on? A complete set of wrenches? A toolbox with drawers that don't stick? She slammed in the second drawer with her shoulder to emphasize her point. A down payment on my own apartment where I won't have to be Audrey's servant anymore? Audrey wouldn't sign the release documents. Cinder opened the third drawer. I know. It would cost more than a silly dress anyway. She grabbed a ratchet and a handful of wrenches and set them on top of the toolbox. Maybe I'd get skin grafting. Your skin is fine. Cinder glanced at Aiko from the corner of her eye. Oh, you mean your cyborg parts? Shutting the third drawer, Cinder grabbed her messenger bag from the work desk and shoveled the tools into it. What else do you think will... Oh, the floor jack. Where did I put that? You're being unreasonable, said Aiko. Maybe you can trade for a dress or get one on consignment. I've been dying to go into that vintage dress store in Sakura. You know the one I mean. Cinder shuffled around the random tools that had collected beneath the work table. It doesn't matter. I'm not going. But it does matter. It's the ball. And the prince. Aiko, I'm fixing an android for him. It's not like we're friends now. Mentioning the prince's android sparked a memory, and a moment later Cinder pulled the floor jack out from behind its tread. And it doesn't matter because Audrey will never let me go. She said if you fix the hover... Right, and after I fix the hover, what about Peony's port screen that's always acting up? What about... She scanned around the room and spotted a rusty android tucked away in the corner. What about that old Guard 7.3? What would Audrey want with that old thing? She doesn't have a garden anymore. She doesn't even have a balcony. I'm just saying she has no real intention of letting me go. As long as she can come up with things for me to fix, my chores will never be done. Cinder shoved a couple of jack stands into her bag, telling herself that she didn't care. Not really. She wouldn't fit in a formal ball anyway. Even if she did find dress gloves and slippers that could hide her metal monstrosities, her mousy hair would never hold a curl, and she didn't know the first thing about makeup. She would just end up sitting just off the dance floor and making fun of the girls who swooned to get Prince Kai's attention, pretending she wasn't jealous, pretending it didn't bother her. Although she was curious about the food, and the prince did know her now, sort of. He had been kind to her at the market. Perhaps he would ask her to dance, out of politeness, out of chivalry, when he saw her standing alone. The precarious fantasy crashed down around her as quickly as it began. It was impossible, not worth thinking about. She was cyborg, and she would never go to the ball. I think that's everything, she said, masking her disappointment by adjusting the messenger bag over her shoulders. You ready? I don't compute, said Aiko. If fixing the hover won't convince Audrey to let you go to the ball, then why are we going to the junkyard? If she wants a mag belt so bad, why doesn't she go dig through the trash to find one? Because ball or no, I do believe she would sell you off for pocket change if given a reason. Besides, with them off to the ball, we'll have the apartment to ourselves. Doesn't that sound nice? It sounds great to me! Oh. It sounds great to me. Cinder turned to see Peony heaving herself through the doorway. She still wore her silver ball gown, but now the hems along the neck and sleeves were finished. A hint of lace had been at her cleavage, accentuating the fact that, at 14, Peony had already developed curves that Cinder couldn't begin to hope for. If Cinder's body had ever been predisposed to femininity, it had been ruined by whatever the surgeons had done to her, leaving her with a stick-straight figure, too angular, too boyish, too awkward with her heavy artificial leg. I'm going to strangle Mom, said Peony. She's making me loony. Pearl needs to find a husband. No, Pearl needs to find a husband. My daughters are such a drain. No one appreciates what I do for them. Yap, yap, yap. She wobbled her fingers in the air in mockery of her mother. What are you doing down here? Hiding. Oh, and to ask you to look if you could look at my port screen. She pulled a handheld screen from her back, offering it to Cinder. Cinder took it, but her eyes were on the bottom of Peony's skirt, watching as the shimmering hem gathered dust bunnies around it. You're going to ruin that dress. Then Audrey will really be a tyrant. Peony stuck out her tongue, but then gathered up her skirt in both fists, hiking the hem up to her knees. So what do you think? She said, bouncing on the balls of her bare feet. You look amazing. Peony preened, wrinkling the fabric more into her fingers, but then her cheeriness faltered. She should have made one for you too. It's not fair. I don't really want to go. Cinder shrugged. Peony's tone had such sympathy that she didn't bother to argue. She was usually able to ignore the jealousy she had towards her stepsisters, how Audrey doted on them, how soft their hands were, especially when Peony was the only human friend she had. But she could not swallow the twitch of envy at seeing Peony in that dress. She brushed the topic away. What's wrong with the port? It's doing that gibberish thing again. Peony pushed some tools off a stack of empty paint bins, choosing the cleanest spot before sitting down, her full skirts flouncing around her. She swung her feet so that her heels beat steadily against the plastic. Have you been downloading those stupid celeb apps again? No. Cinder raised an eyebrow. One language app, that's it, and I need it for class. Oh, before I forget, Aiko, I brought you something. Aiko rolled to Peony's side as she pulled a velvet ribbon from her bodice, leftover trim from the seamstress. The light in the room brightened when Aiko saw it. Thank you, said the android as Peony tied the ribbon around her skinny wrist joint. It's lovely. Cinder set the port screen on the work desk, next to Prince Kai's android. I'll look at it tomorrow. We're off to find a mag belt for Her Majesty. Oh, where are you going? The junkyard. It's going to be a bundle of fun, said Aiko, scanning the makeshift bracelet with her sensor again and again. Really? Can I come? Cinder laughed. She's kidding. Aiko's been practicing her sarcasm. I don't care. Anything's better than going back into that stuffy apartment. Peony fanned herself and absently leaned back against a stack of metal shaving. Reaching out, Cinder pulled her back. Careful, your dress. Peony surveyed her skirt, then the grime-covered shelves, then waved Cinder's concern away. Really? Can I? Sounds exciting. It sounds dirty and stinky, said Aiko. How would you know? You don't have scent receptors, said Cinder. I have a fantastic imagination. Smirking, Cinder half shoved her sister toward the door. Fine. No, fine. Go get changed, but be quick. I have a story to tell you. Chapter 4. Peony slugged Cinder in the shoulder, nearly pushing her into a pile of bald android shreds. How could you wait so long to tell me? You've only been home for, what, 4 hours? I know. I'm sorry, said Cinder, rubbing her shoulder. There wasn't a good time, and I didn't want Audrey to know. I don't want her taking advantage of it. Who cares what Mom thinks? I want to take advantage of this. Good stars. The prince in your booth? I can't believe I wasn't there. Why wasn't I there? You were busy being fitted in silken brocade. Ugh! Peony kicked a broken headlight out of her path. You should have calmed me. I would have been there in 2 seconds. Unfinished ball gown and all. Ugh! I hate you. It's official. I hate you. Are you going to see him again? I mean, you'll have to, right? I mean, I might be able to stop hating you if you promise to bring me with you. All right? Deal? Found one! Aiko called from 10 yards ahead. Her floodlight targeted the body of a rusted hover, entrenching the piles of debris behind it in the shadows. So, what was he like? Peony said, keeping pace as Cinder hurried toward the earthbound vehicle, as if being near her was now on par with being near His Imperial Highness himself. I don't know, said Cinder, unlatching the vehicle's hood and lifting it up on the prop rod. Ah, good. It hasn't been scavenged. Aiko scooted out of Cinder's way. He was polite enough not to point out the... He was polite enough not to point out the giant grease stain on her forehead. Oh, you didn't! What? I'm a mechanic. If I get dirty, if he'd wanted me to get all gussied up... No, what? I'm a mechanic. I get dirty. If he wanted me to get all gussied up, he should have calmed ahead. Aiko, I could use some light in here. Aiko tilted her head forward, eliminating the engine compartment. On Cinder's other side, Peony clicked her tongue. Maybe he thought it was a mole? That makes me feel better. Cinder pulled a pair of pliers from her bag. The night sky was clear, and though the lights from the city blocked out any stars, the sharp crescent moon lurked near the horizon, a sleepy eye squinting through the haze. Is he as handsome in real life as he looks on the net screens? Yes, said Aiko. Even more handsome and awful tall. Everyone's tall to you, Peony leaned against the front bumper, arms folded, and I want to hear Cinder's opinion. Cinder stopped poking the pliers around the engine as the memory of his easy smile rushed to her. Though Prince Kai had long been one of Peony's favorite topics, she was probably in every one of his favorite net fan groups, Cinder had never imagined that she might share the admiration. In fact, she'd always thought Peony's celebrity crush was a little silly, a little pre-adolescent. Prince Kai this, Prince Kai that, an impossible fantasy. But now... Something in Cinder's face must have said enough, because Peony suddenly shrieked and lunged at her, wrapping her arms around Cinder's waist and hopping up and down. I knew it! I knew you liked him too! I can't believe you actually met him! It's not fair! Did I mention how much I hate you? Yes, yes, I know, said Cinder, prying Peony's arms off her. Now go be giddy somewhere else. I'm trying to work. Peony made a face and skipped away, twirling amid the piles of junk. What else? Tell me everything. What did he say? What did he do? Nothing, said Cinder. He just asked me to fix his android. She peeled away from the spider webs from what had once been the hover's solar generator, but was now little more than a plastic shell. A cloud of dust kicked up into her face, and she pulled away, coughing. Ratchet? No. Ratchet? Aiko plucked the ratchet from her torso and handed it to Cinder. What kind of android is it? Asked Peony. Cinder pried the generator from the compartment with a grunt and set it on the ground beside the hover. An old one. Tutor 8.6, said Aiko. Older than me, and he said he would come back to the market next weekend to pick it up. Peony kicked a rusted oil can out of the path before bending over the engine. The news said the market's going to be shut down next week because of the outbreak. Oh, I hadn't heard that. Cinder wiped her hands on her pants, peering down into the engine's lower compartment. I guess we'll have to drop it off at the palace then. Yes! Peony jigged in place. We'll go together, and you can introduce me, and... Aha! Cinder beamed. Mag belt. Peony cupped her cheek in her palm, raising her voice. And then he'll recognize me at the ball, and I'll dance with him, and Pearl will be livid! She laughed as if angering her older sister were life's greatest achievement. If the android's even done before the ball, Cinder selected a wrench from the tool belt slung around her hips. She didn't want to inform Peony that Prince Kai probably wouldn't be the one signing for deliveries at the palace. Peony whisked her hand through the air. Well, or whenever. I want to go to the ball, said Aiko, gazing up at the horizon. It's prejudice not to let androids attend. Petition the government, then. I'm sure Peony will be happy to hear your cause direct to the prince himself. Cinder clamped onto Aiko's spherical head and forced her to aim the light deck into the hood. Now hold still. I've just about got this end detached. Cinder stuck the wrench to Aiko and then pried the mag belt from his bracket, letting it clatter to the ground below. One side down, one to go. She led the way around the hover, clearing a path through the garbage so Aiko's treads wouldn't get stuck. Peony followed and climbed on top of the hover's trunk, folding her legs beneath her. You know, some people are saying he's going to be looking for a bride at the ball. A bride, said Aiko. How romantic! Cinder lowered herself onto her side behind the hover's back bumper and took a small flashlight from her tool belt. Hand me that wrench again. Didn't you hear me? A bride, Cinder. As in a princess. As in, not going to happen. He's only what, 19? Tucking the flashlight between her teeth, Cinder took the wrench from Aiko. The bolts in the back had less rust on them, better protected from the overhanging truck, and took only a few quick turns to loosen. 18.5, said Peony. And it's true. All the gossip links are saying so. Cinder grunted. I would marry Prince Kai in a heartbeat. Me too, said Aiko. Cinder spit out the flashlight and shuffled to the fourth corner. You and every other girl in the Commonwealth. Like you wouldn't, said Peony. Cinder didn't answer as she loosened the final bolt gripping the mag belt. It released and fell to the ground with a clang. There we go. She slid out from beneath the car and tucked the wrench and flashlight into her calf compartment before standing. See any other hovers worth scavenging while we're here? Pulling the mag belt out from beneath the hover, she folded it at its hinges, forming a less cumbersome metal rod. I did see something over there. Aiko swished the light around the stacks. Not sure what model. Great. Lead the way. Cinder nudged the android with the belt. Aiko took off, muttering about being stuck in junkyards while Audrey was all clean and cozy at home. Besides, said Peony, hopping off the trunk, the rumor that he's looking for a bride at the ball is a lot better than what the other rumors are saying. Let me guess. Prince Kai is actually a Martian? Or, no, he had an illegitimate child with an escort, didn't he? Escort droids can have children? It can have children? No. Peony huffed, blowing a curl off her brow. Well, this is even worse. They say there's been talk of him marrying... She dropped her voice into a harsh whisper. Queen Lavana! Queen... No. Queen... Cinder froze and clamped a gloved hand over her mouth, glancing around as if someone could be lurking in the piles of garbage. Listening. She pulled her hand away but kept her voice down. Honestly, Peony, those tabloids are going to rot your brain. I don't want to believe it either, but they're all saying it. That's why the Queen's witchy ambassador has been staying at the palace, so she can secure an alliance. It's all very political. I don't think so. Prince Kai would never marry her. You don't know that. But she did know. Cinder may not know much about intergalactic politics, but she knew Prince Kai would be a fool to marry Queen Lavana. The lingering moon caught Cinder's attention, and a shock of goosebumps covered her arms. The moon had always given her a sense of paranoia, like the people who lived up there could be watching her, and if she stared for too long, she might draw their attention. Superstitious nonsense, but then everything about Lunars was eerie and superstitious. Lunars were a society that evolved from Earth and Moon colonies centuries ago, but they weren't human anymore. People said Lunars could alter a person's brain, make you see things you shouldn't see, feel things you shouldn't feel, do things you didn't want to do. Their unnatural power had made them a greedy and violent race, and Queen Lavana was the worst of all of them. They said she knew when people were talking about her, even thousands of miles away, even down on Earth. They said she'd murdered her older sister, Queen Channery, so she could take the throne from her. They said she'd had her own husband killed too, so she would be free to make a more advantageous match. They said she had forced her stepdaughter to mutilate her own face because, at the sweet age of 13, she had become more beautiful than the jealous queen could stand. They said she killed her niece, her only threat to the throne. Princess Celine had only been 3 years old when a fire caught in her nursery, killing her and her nanny. That's fucked up. Some conspiracy theorists thought the princess had survived and was still alive somewhere, waiting for the right time to reclaim her crown and end Lavana's rule of tyranny. Wouldn't it be really cool if Cinder was Princess Celine? Yeah, that'd be weird. But Cinder knew it was only desperation that fueled these rumors. After all, they'd found traces of the child's flesh in the ashes. Oh. Here! Aiko raised her hand and knocked on a slab of metal jutting from a huge mound of junk, startling Cinder. She shoved the thoughts aside. Prince Kai would never marry that witch. He could never marry a lunar. Racist. Cinder pushed a few rusted aerosol cans and an old mattress aside before she was able to clearly make out the hover's nose. Good eye. Together they shuffled enough junk out of the way so that the full front of the vehicle could be seen. I've never seen one like this, Cinder said, running a hand over the pitted chrome insignia. It's hideous, said Peony with a sneer. What an awful color. It must be really old. Cinder found a latch and pulled open the hood. She drew back, blinking at the mess of metal and plastic that greeted her. Really old. She squinted into the front corner of the engine, but the undercarriage hid the mad belt clamps from view. Huh. Point that light over there, would you? Cinder lowered herself to the dirt. She tightened her ponytail before squirming under the hover, shoving aside the jumble of old parts that had been left to rust in the weeds beneath it. Stars, she muttered when she was able to look up into its belly. Aiko's light filtered down from above, through cables and wires and ducts and manifolds and nuts and bolts. This thing is ancient. It is in a junkyard, said Peony. I'm serious. I've never seen anything like it. Cinder ran a hand along a rubber cable. The light flashed back and forth as Aiko's sensors scanned for the engine from above. Any useful part? Any useful parts? Good question. Cinder's vision tinted blue as she connected to her netlink. Could you read me the VIN by the windshield? She searched the number as Peony read it to her and had the hover's blueprint downloaded in minutes, the display creating an overlaid image on top of the engine above her. Seems to be fairly intact, she murmured, running her fingertips along the cluster of wires over her head. She followed them with her eyes, tilting her head to trace the path from hoses to pulleys to axles, trying to decipher how it all fits together, how it all worked. This is so cool. I'm bored, said Peony. Sighing, Cinder searched for the mag belt on the blueprint, but a green error message flashed in her vision. She just tried magnet, and then just belt, finally receiving a hit. The blueprint lit up a rubber band wrapped around a series of gears encapsulated by a metal cover, something called a timing belt. Oh, it's a car from our time. That's cool. Frowning, Cinder reached up and felt for the bolts and lock washers that attached the cover to the engine block. She thought timing belts hadn't been used since internal combustion had become obsolete. Gasping, she craned her neck to the side. In the deep shadows beneath the vehicle, she could make out something round beside her, connecting it to the bars overhead. A wheel. It's not a hover. It's a car. A gasoline car. Seriously? Said Peony. I thought real cars were supposed to be, I don't know, classy. Indignation flared in Cinder's chest. It has character, she said, feeling for the tire's treads. So, said Aiko a second later, does this mean we can't use any of its parts? Ignoring her, Cinder hungrily scanned the blueprints before her. Oil pan, fuel injectors, exhaust pipes. It's from the second era. Fascinating. Not, said Peony. She suddenly screeched, launching herself back from the car. Cinder started so fast she whapped her head on the front suspension. Peony, what? A rat just came out the window! A big, hairy, fat one! Oh, gross! Groaning, Cinder settled her head back into the dirt, massaging her forehead. That made 2 head injuries in one day. At that rate, she's going to have to buy a new control panel, too. It must have been nesting in the upholstery. We probably scared it. We scared it? Peony's voice carried a shudder with it. Can we go now, please? Cinder sighed. Fine. Dismissing the blueprint, she squirmed out from beneath the car, accepting Aiko's offered grips to stand. I thought all the surviving gasoline cars were in museums, she said, brushing the cobwebs out of her hair. I'm not sure I would label it a survivor, said Aiko, her sensor darkening with the disgust. It looks more like a rotting pumpkin. Cinder shut the hood with a bang, sending an impressive dust cloud over the android. What was that about having a fantastic imagination? With some attention and a good cleaning, it could be restored to its former glory. She caressed the hood. The car's dome-shaped body was a yellow-orange shade that looked sickly under Aiko's light, a color that no one in modern times would choose, but with the antique style of the vehicle, it bordered on charming. Rust was creeping up from the hollow beneath the shattered headlights, arching along the dented fender. One of the black windows was missing, but the seats were intact, albeit mildew-covered and torn and probably home to more than just a few rodents. The steering wheel and the dash seemed to have suffered only minor damage over the years. Maybe it could be our escape car. Peony peered into the passenger's side window. Escape from what? Audrey, New Beijing. We could get out of the Commonwealth altogether. We could go to Europe. Cinder rounded the driver's side and scrubbed the dirt from the window with her glove. On the floor inside, 3 pedals winked up at her. Though hovers were all controlled by computer, she had read enough about old technology to know what a clutch was, and even had a basic idea of how to operate one. This hunk of metal wouldn't get us to the city limits, said Peony. Stepping back, Cinder dusted off her hands. They were probably right. Maybe this wasn't a fantasy vehicle. Maybe it wasn't their key to salvation. But somehow, someday, she would leave New Beijing. She would find a place where no one knew who she was or what she was. Plus, we couldn't afford the gasoline, continued Aiko. We could trade in your new foot and still not be able to afford enough fuel to get us out of here. Plus the pollution fines. Plus, I'm not getting in this thing. There's probably decades worth of rat droppings under those seats. Peony cringed. Ew! Cinder laughed. All right, I get it. I won't make you guys push the car home. Whew! You had me worried, said Peony. She smiled because she hadn't really been worried and flipped her hair off her shoulder. Cinder's eye caught on something, a dark spot below Peony's collarbone, visible just above the collar of her shirt. Hold still, she said, reaching forward. Peony did the opposite, panicking and swiping at phantoms on her chest. What? What is it? A bug? A spider? I said hold still! Cinder grabbed Peony by the wrist, swiping at the spot, and froze. Dropping Peony's arm, she stumbled back. What? What is it? Peony tugged on her shirt, trying to see, but then spotted another spot on the back of her hand. Oh no. She looked up at Cinder, blood draining from her face. A rash? She said. From the car? Cinder gulped and neared her with hesitant footsteps, holding her breath. She reached again for Peony's collarbone and pulled the fabric from her shirt down, revealing the entire spot in the moonlight. A splotch of red, rimmed with bruised purple. Her fingers trembled. She pulled away, meeting Peony's gaze. Peony screamed. Chapter 5. Peony's shrieks filled the junkyard, seeping into the cracks of broken machinery and outdated computers. Cinder's auditory interface couldn't protect her from the shrill memory, even as Peony's voice cracked and she dissolved into hysteria. Cinder stood trembling, unable to move, wanting to comfort Peony, wanting to run away. How was this possible? Peony was young, healthy. She couldn't be sick. Peony cried, brushing repeatedly at her skin, the spots. Cinder's netlink took over, as it did in moments when she couldn't think for herself, searching, connecting, feeding information to her she didn't want. Letumosis, the blue fever, worldwide pandemic, hundreds of thousands dead, unknown cause, unknown cure. Peony! She tentatively reached over, but Peony stumbled back, swiping at her wet cheeks and nose. Don't come near me! You'll get it! You'll all get it! Cinder retracted her hand. She heard Aiko at her side, fan whirring, saw the blue light darting over Peony around the junkyard, flickering. She was scared. I said get back! Peony collapsed to her knees, hunching over her stomach. Cinder took 2 steps away, then lingered, watching Peony rock herself back and forth in Aiko's spotlight. I need to call an emergency hover to come and take you away. Peony didn't respond. Her whole body was rattling. Cinder could hear her teeth chattering in between the wails. Cinder shivered. She rubbed at her arms, inspecting them for spots. She couldn't see any, but she eyed her right glove with distrust, not wanting to remove it, not wanting to check. She stepped back again. The junkyard shadows loomed toward her. The plague. It was here, in the air, in the garbage. How long did it take for the first symptoms of the plague to show up? Or, she thought of Cheng Sacha at the market, the terrified mob running from her booth, the blare of the sirens. Her stomach plummeted. Was this her fault? Had she brought the plague home from the market? She checked her arms again, swiping at the invisible bugs that crawled over her skin. Stumbled back. Peony's sobs filled her head, suffocating her. A red warning flashed across her retina display, informing her that she was experiencing elevated levels of adrenaline. She blinked away, and then called up her comlink with a writhing gut, and sent a simple message before she could question it. Emergency. Tai Hang District. Junkyard. Letumosis. She clenched her jaw, feeling the painful dryness of her eyes. A throbbing headache told her that she should be crying, that her sobs should match her sister's. Why? Said Peony, her voice stammering. What did I do? You didn't do anything, said Cinder. This isn't your fault. But it might be mine. What should I do? Aiko asked, What should I do? What should I do? Aiko asked, almost too quiet to be heard. I don't know. A hover is on its way, said Cinder. Peony rubbed her nose with her forearm. Her eyes were rimmed in red. You need to go! You'll catch it! Feeling dizzy, Cinder realized she had been breathing too shallowly. She took another step away before filling her lungs. Maybe I already have it. Maybe it's my fault you caught it. The outbreak at the market today. I didn't think I was close enough, but... Peony, I'm so sorry. Peony squeezed her eyes and buried her face again. Her brown hair was a mess of tangles hanging across her shoulders, stark against her pale skin. A hiccup followed by another sob. I don't want to go. I know. It was all Cinder could think to say. Don't be scared. You'll be all right. She couldn't lie. Not when it would be so obvious. I wish there was something... She stopped herself. She heard the sirens before Peony did. I'm so sorry. Peony swiped at her nose with her sleeve, leaving a trail of mucus, then kept crying. She didn't respond until the wails of the sirens reached her ears and her head snapped up. She stared into the distance, the entrance of the junkyard somewhere beyond the trash heaps, eyes rounded, lips trembling, face blotchy red. Cinder's heart shriveled in on itself. She couldn't help herself. If she was going to catch it, she already had. She fell to her knees, wrapping Peony up in both arms. Her tool belt dug into her hip, but she ignored it as Peony grasped at her t-shirt, sobs renewed. I'm so sorry. What will you tell Mom and Pearl? Cinder bit her lips. I don't know. Then, the truth, I guess. Bile rose in her mouth. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe stomach sickness was a symptom. She looked down at her forearm, embracing Peony to her. Still no spots. Peony shoved her away, scooting back in the dirt. Stay away! You might not be sick yet, but they would take you. You have to get out of here. Cinder hesitated. She heard the crunch of treads over scattered aluminum and plastic. She didn't want to leave Peony, but what if she really hadn't caught it yet? She sat back on her heels, then clambered to her feet. Yellow lights were nearing from the shadows. Cinder's right hand sweating in its glove. Her breathing had shallowed again. Peony. Go! Go away! Cinder stepped back. Had the bleary sense to stop and pick up the folded mag belt. She moved toward the exit, her human leg as numb as the prosthesis. Peony's sobs chased after her. 3 white androids met her around a corner. They had yellow sensors and red crosses painted on their heads, and 2 were pushing a hovering gurney between them. Are you the Letimosis victim? One said in a neutral voice, holding up an ID scanner. Cinder hit her wrist. No, my sister, Lynn Peony. She's that way to the left. The medroids with the gurney wheeled away from her, down the path. Have you had direct contact with the victim in the past 12 hours? The remaining android asked. Cinder opened her mouth, hesitated. Guilt and fear curdled in her gut. She could lie. There was no proof she had it yet. But if they took her to the quarantines, she didn't stand a chance. But if she went home, she could infect everyone. Audrey, Pearl, those screeching, laughing children rushing through the hallways. She could barely hear her own voice. Yes. Are you showing symptoms? No, not that I know of. I feel lightheaded, but not... She stopped herself. The medroid neared her, its treads grating on the dirty ground. Cinder stumbled away from it, but it said nothing, only inched closer until Cinder's calves were pressed against a rotting storage crate. It held up the ID scanner in one pronged hand, and then a third arm appeared from within its torso, a syringe and a pile of grippers. Cinder shuddered, but didn't resist as it grabbed her right wrist and inserted the needle. She flinched, watching as dark liquid, almost black in the android's yellow light, was pulled up from the syringe. She was not afraid of needles, but their world began to tilt. The android moved it just in time for her to slump down on the crate. What are you doing? What are you doing? She whispered, initiating blood scan for Letimosis-carrying pathogens. Cinder heard a motor start up inside the android, faint beeps announcing each step. The android's light dimmed it as its power source was diverted. She held her breath until her control panel kicked in and forced her lungs to contract. ID, said the android, holding the scanner out to her. A red light passed over her wrist and the scanner beeped. The android stashed it away in its hollow torso. She wondered how long it would take for her to finish the scan and determine that she was a carrier, confirming that she was at fault. For everything. The sound of treads approached along the path. Cinder turned her head as the two androids appeared with Peony atop their gurney. She was sitting up with her hands wrapped around her knees. Swollen eyes wildly darting around the junkyard as if searching for an escape, as if she'd stumbled into a nightmare. But she didn't try to run. No one ever put up a fight when being taken to the quarantines. Their eyes met. Cinder opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She tried to plead forgiveness with her eyes. The faintest of smiles touched Peony's lips. She raised a hand and waved with only her fingers. Cinder returned it, knowing it should be her. She had already outlived fate once. She should be the one being carted away. She should be the one dying. It should be her. It was about to be her. She tried to speak, to tell Peony that she would be right behind her. She wouldn't be alone, but then the android beeped. Scan complete. No letumosis carrying pathogens detected. Subject is urged to stand back 50 feet from the infected patient. Cinder blinked. Relief and dread both squirmed inside her. She wasn't sick. She wasn't going to die. She wasn't going with Peony. We will alert you via comm when Lynn Peony enters the subsequent stages of the diseases. Thank you for your cooperation. Cinder grabbed her arms around herself and watched Peony lay down as she was being carted away, curling up like a child on the gurney. I think that's a good stopping point. So Cinder possibly killed Peony. Well, no, because Cinder didn't have it, so it's not on her. So the disease is just everywhere in the junkyard. I wonder if it has to do with old tech. But why didn't Cinder get it? I guess the questions are, why was Cinder not affected? What affected Peony? What's the thing up with the old car? And when's the next time we're going to do something like this? Well, I don't know, but maybe we'll do something fun like this in the future. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, yada, yada, yada. Have a good one out there.